Hello, welcome to Lecture 1, History 280, History of Alcohol and Drugs. I'm your professor, Bradley Cadle. I'm sitting here in the nice summery atmosphere, and I'll be posting these lectures every week from different locations. Some of them are saved from last semester actually as well, but this is a fresh new one. I am going to be adding more material as we move through the course, not all of which will be required. I'll note if things are required. Most of the required readings are already on your syllabus, those two texts that we're reading. And then we'll have our weekly quizzes and our discussions. But let's delve right into some of the material that's involved in chapters 1 and 2 in History of Alcohol, as well as that video documentary that you watched on the history of wine. But speaking of material in chapter 1, again, have a notebook ready and write down terms. These will help you on the quizzes as well as on the final exam. So we know that from the earliest history, humankind has had a relationship with alcohol. First thing, understand a little bit about the science of what alcohol is. It comes from sugars, right? It's a natural process. It naturally occurs in nature. Other species have been known to have felt the effects of alcohol. Birds, butterflies, even elephants have essentially gotten drunk. Whether they intentionally done so is a matter of speculation, probably for the most part not. But certainly humans have sought alcohol out for various purposes, right? For religious and ceremonial purposes, even in the Christian traditions and the Islamic traditions, of course, it is prohibited by the Quran. But even that prohibition, as we will see, tells us a lot about alcohol, and it's naturally seems to be a disruptive kind of commodity, a good that people trade in, and has been viewed controversially. But let's don't get ahead of our story. I was talking about the natural effects of alcohol, the nature of alcohol, the science of alcohol. Alcohol's usage probably goes back as far as we can go back to hunter-gatherer societies. It doesn't appear that Native Americans in most of North America used much alcohol, although certainly they did in Central and South America, which we'll talk about, and probably they did even in North America, but in probably limited ways. But there's one reason why it's difficult to detect alcohol's usage in early nomadic or hunter-gatherer societies before the agricultural revolution about 8,000 years ago or so. And that's because it was done on a small scale, and it was probably kept in skins or wooden containers that we have no record of today. But we know that palm wine was used in Africa thousands and thousands of years ago, for example. And the earliest usages of alcohol by humans was probably that which came from fruit, because that's where it occurs quite naturally, and it's easy to make palm wine, for example. The sweeter the fruit, the more sugar it has in it, the easier you can get a lot alcohol from that. And basically, you just have to let it set, and it will naturally become alcohol as it breaks down. So the big change comes, of course, with the rise of civilizations. And we know, as students of history, or you should know, some of this is an introductory course, but we're looking at world history through the lens, I like to say, of the history of alcohol. So you're going to be learning basic structure of world civilizations in this class. And one thing you have to know is that the agricultural revolution occurred about 8,000 years ago. It occurs in the Middle East, in what is known as Mesopotamia, and it also occurs about the same time along the Yellow River in ancient China. And both of those ancient civilizations as well will use alcohol. Now, some people have actually even made the argument that the agricultural revolution was in part due to people wanting to settle down and drink beer. That is probably an overblown argument, but it does point out a very important fact. As soon as people seemed to settle down so they could grow food and have a more steady food supply, so they could feed more people, they also began brewing beer from the grains that they were growing. And the other thing to recognize about the science of alcohol is that beer takes longer to make than simple fruit wines. Okay, and you need to soak the grains first. If you think about a grain of wheat or barley, it has a husk on it, or a sheath. The sheath, if you soak it, you can penetrate through it, and you can separate the sheath and get at the grain itself, where the sugars are. That's what you need to make the beer. And then you've got to let it ferment as well. So beer making, as is pointed out by Roderick Phillips in A History of Alcohol, is a more complicated process than making simple fruit wines. People were on the move so much in nomadic societies before civilizations that they didn't have probably the time nor the skills and the background to make beer. But beer is also an important way of preserving the proteins that come from your harvest. So the earliest civilizations were drinking beer, and it appears as though they were drinking quite a lot of beer, and they were using it probably in ceremonies. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were sometimes buried with stone casks of beer. So it was an important part of their culture. It was an important part of their daily diets. And people began to also probably claim that there were health benefits to it as well. A lot of those early civilizations would not have too much record because there are very few written records from that time. We have the early clay tablets from Samaria, and there are references to beer in those tablets as well. Now, in Chapter 2 in Roderick Phillips's Alcohol: A History, this is where we begin to see a more complicated culture surrounding alcohol developing, especially with the rise of what is called viticulture. Write this down, viticulture. Another word that comes from this is viands, viands. This refers to anything that is made from grapes. Think of the words that we still have today: vineyard, a grapeyard. We associate vineyards still today with grape production. The Phoenicians, who were Greeks, and then the greater Greek culture, and after them the Romans, all of them began a really intense effort at growing grapes, or viticulture. Planting vineyards and becoming more and more knowledgeable in growing hybrid types of grapes, which were particularly good at making wine from. So this is also from the Greeks and then from the Romans, where we get the elitism surrounding wine. Wine is better than beer. This is a kind of a stereotype that you still see in kind of high culture today. So keep that in mind. It comes from the Greeks and the Romans. And probably this had more practical ideas as well. The Greeks were growing a lot of grapes. They were making wine from very early on. You can read about Philip of Macedonia, the father of Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great himself, the great conqueror. That's why he was called the Great, having a great fondness for alcohol and for wine and for alcoholic beverages in general. Probably an alcoholic he was. He still got a lot of things done. But wines became, in the Greek world and then later for the Romans, important in their exporting economy. They began exporting wine, this commodity of wine, in amphoras. These were the containers which held the wine. The two-handled containers. We have pictographs, pictures on these. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of these things that you can see in some museums around the world today, with pictures on them of people enjoying themselves, often drinking out of straws. The beer and wine that they were drinking in these days was often, by our standards, kind of gross because, to use a kind of gross word, it contained floaties. So they often drank it with straws. I will also mention as well that when you drink alcoholic beverages through straws, it tends to go to your head more. There's more oxygen. It's oxygenated more. You get drunk faster, basically, when you're drinking out of straws. So just something I'm noting here. It's not mentioned in your textbook. But they began exporting the wine around the globe and telling everybody else the wine is the best. Of course they would say that, right? Because they want people to be drinking it and to buy it because it's good for their economy, right? They're an export economy, exporting all around the ancient Mediterranean world, from North Africa to present-day Turkey, all those islands such as Cyprus and the Greek islands and Italy, and probably as far as Spain, if not even farther. So they preferred wine. They thought wine had more benefits for them. Greeks had a different way of, and even Romans, of thinking about medicine and the physical body, or physical bodies. They explained it in terms of humors. I'm not going to expect you to know the different humors that the Greeks and Romans believed in, but one of the things was they believed in this idea of balancing the different humors, and there were people that whose bodies ran a little hot, and there's people whose bodies ran a little bit cold, and they thought that wine was good for people that with cold humors, overabundance of coldness. They could be warmed up by wine. It had beneficial health benefits. So it was associated often with alchemy. You know, this is before the kind of science of medicine that comes in the 17, 1800s with the scientific method. So in addition to using it for ritualistic, religious purposes, they were also using it as medicine. They often began to realize as well in the Greek world, as they began to build bigger and bigger cities, right, that people who drank a lot of water often got sick. This is called potable water, drinkable water. It's another term you should be aware of. And this probably also helps to explain why rich people were in the ancient Roman world were living longer than poor people, because they could afford to drink wines rather than drinking waters. And the Romans were attentive to some of these ideas of urban hygiene, of keeping the cities clean. You can think of this. Rome had reached the astonishing population of 1 million people. Think of the organization of food and water supplies that it would take to feed a city of 1 million people before there is mass mechanization and road systems and trains and things like that to supply the city. They had to do all of this, with horses and manpower, human power, right? So keep that in mind as well. I should have also mentioned the symposium in Greek culture. The Greeks, the Romans had their use of their version of the symposium as well. They call it the convivium. And think of this word convivial as well. Symposium we use today, it's kind of a highfalutin word that means a meeting, oftentimes within education, right? I've attended symposia, that's the plural of symposium, in graduate school, right? But in Greek times, the symposium was kind of a pretty drunken affair. It centered largely around alcohol. It wasn't just a kind of toga party, as we might think of it today, although it did have that aspect, and they did warn against overindulgence in alcohol in the symposium. There was a lot of game playing, a lot of what we would describe as machismo as well. A lot of the games would require a certain degree of dexterity, so they like to have fun, but they discouraged it sometimes getting too drunk, so you drank your strong glass of wine first, and then you watered it down so you could continue to participate without being too obnoxious, right? So the symposium is important. The convivium, and as the Romans called it, think of the word convivial. That's one of the things about alcohol, is that it tends to loosen your inhibitions. It's essentially, it's good for the gab, right? It's good for socializing. People talk more, have a good time, and increasingly, this is where alcohol will be consumed, is in a place where it is sold and often taxed as well, but is in a place for sociability, right? Where you go to get the news, the taberna, as it was called in ancient Greece, or the tavern. All these things made alcohol an important part of ancient Roman and Greek civilizations. So all of that is laid out for you in some detail in chapters 1 and 2 of A History of Alcohol. So look over those chapters. I'm going to conclude it here for today and post this for you, and I will see you all on the discussion board online.
16 minutes. Stop taking video button.